So we finished up Numbers. We're looking at the plan of redemption. If you don't know, or maybe skipped a couple, or whatever. So we're looking at the plan of redemption as seen from Genesis to Revelation, because there are so many people who think that the cross is just an afterthought, and that God did not have Jesus and His sacrifice in mind from even before the creation of the world. And so we are looking at that this morning. We've been looking at that, rather. We went through Genesis, Exodus. Exodus took a couple of weeks. And so just briefly going to look at a couple of things in Leviticus and then kind of move on from there. Now, last week we were looking at their year at Sinai and things of that nature. And so Leviticus is considered the gospel of the Old Testament. Now we understand 66 books in the Bible, but it's all one book. We know that the gospel, or the word gospel, means good news. And when we look at these 66 books, we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and those are generally called the Gospels. That's not to try to draw away from the fact and say that there is no good news anywhere else in Scripture. You might just add in the word according, like the Gospel according to Matthew. This is the good news as Matthew saw it, or the good news as Luke saw it, or John, or what have you. So we understand that. Well, Leviticus is considered the gospel, the good news, if you will, of the Old Testament. What Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are to the New Testament, Leviticus is to the Old Testament. And I'll tell you, Leviticus, I used to dread reading that book until I got to school. And then it really became, even though it can seem tedious, it really became one of my favorite Old Testament books. It might sound odd because of everything that's going on there. Because in Leviticus, chapters 1 through 10, they set forward sacrifices in the priesthood. Specifically, the first couple of chapters, those first 5 chapters, are really talking about sacrifice and what's done and the details and how it's performed and whatnot. And, Leviticus, even though it can be tedious and we might even think, okay, why is this even in here? I'm not living in the Old Testament. I'm not Jewish. I am not out there sacrificing, my childhood goat, whose name is Billy, at the temple at Freetown Road. My dad grew up on a farm in Georgia. He had a goat, and he wasn't very inventive, so he named the goat Billy. Go figure. Anyhow, so we might wonder, well, why is it even in here? But when we consider the Jewish people, the fact that Christ was not a Christian, Christ was Jewish. I know, kind of newsflash, right? And so it really helps us to understand the world in which they were living. It helps us to understand cleansing practices. You think of Jesus going to lepers and walking right up to them and healing them and having no problems. Well, we learn part of the reason from the book of Leviticus and how they were to be outside the camp and they were supposed to be yelling out, unclean, unclean, and they weren't supposed to have anything to do with people. We learn all of those things in Leviticus. When we look at the atonement of Christ, that's in Leviticus. And so we have these things at chapters 1 through 10, again, dealing with sacrifices and the priesthood. Chapters 11 through 15, they deal with different types of defilement. Meats, childbirth, leprosy, bodily discharges, we'll say. Leviticus chapter 16 handles the Day of Atonement, which is the most solemn day on the Jewish calendar. And of course, that is a solemn remembrance for us. When we look at, that day, it was a sacred annual reminder of the contamination for sin. man's inability to deal with sin and the necessity of divine intervention, while at the same time it would point to the weakness of Judaism in being able to provide a permanent solution because of all of the sacrifices that were having to be made. You know, depending on what the sacrifice was for, would depend on, you know, how often it was made and what have you. You know, it's interesting because there are even some common things that we have today that you might not think of that come from Scripture. Have you ever called someone, or do you know someone, or maybe this is you, and you said like they're the black sheep of the family? Or you ever heard that phrase? You know that's from Leviticus? In that they would sit there and they would tie the sins of the people. They would sacrifice the clean, the pure lamb and what have you, and then the black one, the spotted one, have the sins of the people tied to it and sent out of the camp. It's kind of like the black sheep of the family is someone who's ostracized of the family and they're kind of put out. There's a whole lot of things in there, even in modern times. But with that Day of Atonement, so we have the contamination of sin. It's looking toward that. Man's inability to deal with sin, the necessity of divine intervention, and the weakness of Judaism to be able to provide a permanent solution. Hebrews 10 and verse 4. Hebrews 10 and verse 4 reminds us that it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. You know? But it was really a sign of faith. And when we look at Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 15, in kind of a roundabout way, I mean, it's direct, but could have been clearer maybe, I guess, I don't know. But it tells us that the blood of Christ covers those who were guilty in the first covenant. And so really this sacrifice of bulls and goats or pigeons was a matter of faith and obedience, right? Just as today is that Christ, He takes away sins, but you know, we're not saved right now. I know that a lot of people, they sit there and they say, you know, I'm saved, right? Okay, well, and this is maybe a strange way to put it, but you're really kind of partially saved. See, because you're not fully saved until when, maybe? Right, you die. You're judged and you're found to be faithful. You know, there are plenty of people in the world who they say, well, I'm saved, I'm saved, I'm saved. But they are completely unfaithful. And do they really think that they can be unfaithful in this world and still be saved?
Some do.
Well, yeah, some do. Right. And so really, you know, to say that, yes, we are covered by the blood of Christ. Yes, there is mercy. Yes, there is grace. But you don't want to take salvation to the extent that you're saying, I cannot lose my salvation, which is what many people do, right? You can't be saved and be unfaithful at the same time, you know, or live a life of unfaithfulness, I should say. And so the regulations that are put there in Leviticus, they were designed by God to insulate Israel from the pagan practices and produce holiness in daily life. And we see that in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 7. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 7, consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, for I am the Lord your God. So the rules, if you will, the regulations, these things that God is laying out in Leviticus, that's to carry them not just when they're with each other, but when they're carried off, for example, into Babylonian captivity. When they are going to, you know, Jerusalem later on, and how they are to insulate themselves. And that principle applies even to the New Testament, and we get to all of these kind of rules and regulations and whatnot. And I'll be honest, is that we probably don't follow 90% of them, 90 to 95% of them. Because believe it or not, in the New Testament, there's over 3,000 commandments for Christians. You know? We thought the Old Testament, they had it bad, right? But it's a matter, even in the New Testament, of God putting these things in place to insulate His people, to be away from the world, to come out of the world, to be holy, for He is holy, right? Leviticus, I believe it's chapter 10, verses 44 and 45. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God, therefore be holy, for I am holy. What did Peter say? You are a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people of God's own possession, right? And so you can look at it kind of this way, and it's a little bit about out of order, but if you were to break down Leviticus into 4 groups, you could say Leviticus chapters 11 through 15, sin is pictured, okay? Leviticus 1 through 10 is the provisions of grace. Leviticus 17 through 27 is grace coupled with an obedient faith. And then Leviticus 16, everything merges on the Day of Atonement. So you see that you've got this picture of sin, you've got God's grace in there, you have people obeying as a result of their faith, and then finally things coming to a culmination, a fruition on the Day of Atonement. Anybody need me to repeat those 4? Okay. So Leviticus 11 through 15, sin is pictured. Leviticus 11 through 15, sin is pictured. And I can put this little thing on the Facebook group as well. Leviticus 1 through 10 is the provisions of grace. So Leviticus 11 through 15, sin is pictured. Leviticus 1 through 10, provisions of grace. Leviticus 17 through 27, obedient faith. Leviticus 17 through 27, obedient faith. Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. I'll repeat real quick. Leviticus 11 through 15, sin is pictured. Leviticus 1 through 10, provisions of grace. Leviticus 17 through 27, obedient faith. Leviticus 16, Day of Atonement. Well, that's just showing because it mirrors really what happened in kind of Genesis 3 in the sense that you have sin. You've got Genesis 3:6, you've got the sin, and then you've got God extending grace and everything pointing toward the cross. So that's just the reason that those categories are out of order there. It's just kind of mirroring Genesis chapter 3 and what's happening. Because remember, the plan of redemption, everything is pointing back to Genesis chapter 3, right? But again, Leviticus is the good news, the gospel of God's provisions for sin through the priesthood and sacrifice in view of the coming reality of the priesthood and sacrifice of Christ. Okay? When we look at the priests and their duties, which we find here in Leviticus, and their responsibilities and what they did in atoning for the sins of the people, but through sacrifice, that we see that in Christ. And what did Christ do on the cross? Yeah, He died. It's not a trick question. He died. It's not a trick question. He died. He was the atonement, the propitiation, which is really it's a paying of ransom. Ransom, you think, is that once you have something in your possession, it's stolen from you, and then you get a ransom call, and it's like, hey, yeah, we have your child, we want $5 million, and I'm like, you can keep my kid, trust me, you'll give them back in like 12 hours. Trust me. If you spend time with my children, you will give them back. Okay? And that's the idea of the cross, is that we were once with God, spiritually speaking. Sin comes in, steals us away from God, and so Christ pays that ransom, right? But again, that comes through obedient faith. And the Pharisees, they tried to make the law of Moses a legalistic system. But that was their doing, not God's. In every age, salvation has been freely given by grace through faith because of Calvary. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace you've been saved through faith, not of yourselves, and not the result of works, so that no one may boast. It's a gift of God, right? That's been available the entire time. The Old Testament, they just didn't have that, and so they had the obedient faith, but they looked forward to the glory that was to come through the sacrifice of the cross. And that's no different than us, right? Granted, the cross, in an event sense, of when Jesus was crucified, that is in the past. But his blood continues to cover. And so we, just like they in the Old Testament, look forward to the glory of the cross. We here, even though we're New Testament Christians, and it's after the event of that day, in AD 32, 33, we look forward to that glory, right? So really, we're not in much of a different position. Leviticus looks back to sin's beginning in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. The onset of redemption through the seed of woman in Genesis 3 and verse 15. Remember, is that redemption is going to come through her seed. God is speaking to the serpent and says that you will bruise his heel, that he will crush your head. And so Leviticus is looking back to sin. It's looking back to the promise of redemption. It's looking back to the seed of Abraham there in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3 with the Abrahamic covenant. And then it's looking to the fulfillment of the cross that we see in Hebrews 9 and verse 15. Does that make sense? We're all up, right? Okay. If you're not, and don't feel bad if you get up or something during class. I mean, I'm standing up in class. There's some bagels over here with some cream and cheese if you would like, and there's coffee. You can make your own coffee there. Anyhow, I say that in case you needed to pick me up this morning, okay? And don't everybody go at once, because then that would be rude. You know, if 15 people got all up at once and we're canceling just for everybody to stand with the bagels. Any questions or comments, though? Or thoughts? Observations of your own? Okie dokie. So that's really kind of what Leviticus is about. I'm not going to get bogged down in it. And then we're kind of moving to the book of Numbers and their final preparation for leaving Sinai. The book of Numbers, it opens 1 month after the erection of the tabernacle and with about 3 weeks remaining prior to leaving Sinai. Okay? A little bit of a breakdown. In Numbers chapters 1 through 10, and again, I can put this in the Facebook group if you don't want to take it down. In Numbers chapters 1 through 10, the nation of Israel is numbered and organized. Okay? So they're numbered. You've got the tribes separated and what have you. Final preparations are made before leaving Sinai to make their way toward Canaan. And it's actually in these chapters that we find the principles for pattern and orderliness that are seen throughout the Bible. The pattern for Israel's encampment around the tabernacle. And you can go online and Google this, just like the tribes around the tabernacle. And there's one specific image that displays it really well because, obviously not all of the tribes are not evenly numbered or anything, right? Some have more, some have less. But there is actually an image that kind of shows it if you were looking from a particular mountain, looking down at the tabernacle with the tribes surrounding it. It's kind of interesting because it actually shows you the image of the cross with the tabernacle in the center. It's actually kind of interesting to see that. Based on the numbers that were in the tribes and how they were ordered, you can see the cross there with God in the center. Just stuff that was kind of interesting, thought I'd share, and I can put that in the Facebook group too.
How do you find that?
You just maybe Google tribes of Israel plus cross or something like that. You know? Or if someone wants to Google it while we're here and then can show afterwards, you know. So not only that, the placement of the three families of Levi around the tabernacle and their responsibilities for service. The Levites, every priest was a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest, right? And the Levites, they were one of the tribes. They were just kind of chosen. There's speculation as to why, but no definite reason as to why it was this one and not that one. And that is also something that Calvinists will use in, for example, God's their idea of predestination, and also other scriptures like Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and that type of thing. It also, the law of restitution and determining the truth about an adulteress. That's over there in Numbers. And of course, that too plays a part when we look in the New Testament. You have, for example, the Samaritan woman there in John chapter 4 who's had multiple husbands, you know, but even when she's with isn't her husband. We have the woman accused of adultery pulled out into the street when people are wanting to stone her. And so information about that is in Numbers. Nazirite vows. Those are found in Numbers. And Samson was a Nazirite, or he took Nazirite vows. And yet we look at that and we can see him breaking vows and some of the things that he was doing. And we can also see how, because of the, and we wouldn't know this without the book of Leviticus, that Samson was unclean a lot of the time because some of the things that he was doing, like touching a dead animal and killing people with a jawbone of an ox and whatnot. And yet he would have been considered unclean according to God's law and Mosaic law. The supplementary Passover that's in there, a supplementary, so you have Passover, but if there's someone who can't make it to Passover, like they can't travel or whatnot, so there's kind of a supplementary Passover in there. There's also the role of instruments in assemblies, marches, wars, festivals, sacrificial offerings, and what have you. All right? And that also shows a contrast, because when we look in Colossians and Ephesians 3:16 and 5:19 about not having mechanical instruments in the assembly today, we see how different it is. How this was under one system and was regulated under one system, and how we are under a new system. We are under the law of Christ. Patternism, though, is not a popular concept, especially in today's culture. Because pattern implies that someone with authority has set that pattern in place and that it's unchangeable. So it's not a popular concept. Because to have a pattern, and if you didn't design the pattern, then what's that mean? Someone else designed the pattern, right? And they're saying that you have to follow this particular pattern if you want to do things right. And so it's not popular. And for the nation of Israel, just as Christians, the one who set the pattern is God. You know, He set the pattern in the Old Testament, set the laws in the Old Testament, how the worship was in the Old Testament, regulated things in the Old Testament, and just as He does for New Testament Christians. Right? How we're to worship, how we're to conduct ourselves, and what have you. Right? Any thoughts or comments so far? Okie dokie. Human will, and we'll see this in later lessons, it starts to rise and it decides to reject God's pattern and instill His own will. This is especially prevalent in the book of Judges, right? When we have the people who, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, they sin, a judge is sent to proclaim God's wrath on the people. The people repent, the judge goes back and is praying to God and what have you, and then the people, they kind of get back in line a little bit, only to do it like in the next chapter. Not a great period in Israel's history, right? So they start to reject God. Israel's preparatory year at Mount Sinai has come to an end. The law has been given, the tabernacle has been constructed, the priesthood and the sacrificial system are in place, the nation has been numbered and organized, the final things have been prepared for their departure. God is now ready. More than that, the people are now ready to enter into Canaan as a gift of this grace, right? And so it's just a matter of preparing themselves. God is preparing them, getting the nation ready before they go into the land that He has promised, right? It's kind of like, get your act together, and then you're going to go do this, right? And we'll see there's some problems, before even getting there, right? Because not everybody's going in. Any thoughts or comments?
I guess God did not promise the Israelites that He rescued from Egypt. He did not promise that they would see the land.
Yeah,
He
when
broke that promise. If He did, then He broke that promise.
like when He made the promise in Genesis 12 with Abram, and He's saying, it's a land that I will show you. It's more the people that He's speaking about. It's going to be your seed and what have you, and then of course it's renewed with Isaac and Jacob and whatnot. But yeah, there wasn't a promise that I am going to take you into this land, because if God said you are going into, I don't know, what would like a good Old Testament Hebrew Mike name be?
Okay.
Really? Miguel is what you come up with?
Well, I think it's there.
I'm not very bright this early in the morning. What can I say?
Okay, so Mike, aka Bubba Zemer, you are going into this land. Well, if God promises me that, and I don't see that land, then God has broken His own word. And God is not a man that He can lie. And He's not going to break his promises. But yeah, so no, not to them specifically. So we come in here to Numbers, and we're just going to kind of skip up to Numbers 11. Really, the first generation of Israelites. They've demonstrated that they would not be the ones to enjoy the fulfillment of God's promise. And if anything, the opening verse of Numbers chapter 11 confirms this, when at the beginning of verse 1 in chapter 11 of Numbers, and the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. These people have been complaining left and right. Complaining is often an expression of unbelief. Not always, but often an expression of unbelief. It's certainly an expression of a non-appreciation for the good. Maybe not looking at the silver lining, not seeing the good that God has done. Something bad will happen in our life, and we'll complain and we'll complain and we'll complain. Some people will blame God for it, but then they don't look at the good that God has done in their life. Right? It's kind of the idea here with these people, is that they're complaining there. Even though they were enslaved for 400 years, when Moses and Aaron appeared among them, confirming the miraculous signs that God was with them, and that it was He who sent Moses, they were living in the presence of divine power, and yet they're complaining. The pillar of fire, the cloud, the manna from heaven, all of these were constant reminders of God's nearness to them, His love, His mercy, His grace. But unfortunately, the people responded with nothing but complaints. often expressing their desire to have lived in Egypt as slaves rather than, and die there rather than live for God.
Were all of them complain? Were there any that didn't?
I mean, well, and with the Old Testament, it's hard to say because the people is generalized, and so it's more that, yeah, pretty much, well, most, Moses wasn't complaining, at least. And we're about to see here in a little bit that it was even his own family.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's not unique to them. Christians do the same thing many times, right? Maybe they find the Christian life too difficult and be like, you know what, it would be easier if I were just still off doing this. I used to enjoy doing this. I know that it was hard, made me miserable half the time, but it was so much fun.
Yeah.
I loved being miserable. Misery loves company. Come with me, right? And so a lot of the times it's that Christians would rather go back to the life that they were living and not be Christians anymore. I mean, we have backsliding, we call it that, or people leaving the church or falling away. And Jesus would say in Luke chapter 9 and verse 62, no man having set his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. If you want heaven, you can't go back, right? But here's something that, as New Testament Christians, we need to pay attention to. In Numbers 11, look at verses 4 and 5. Now, the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, so we've got two groups. We've got a rabble, and then we've got the people of Israel, okay? So now the rabble that was among the people of Israel, we'll say, had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. So who was the rabble? Well, if we look back to Exodus chapter 12 and verse 38, we discover that it was the mixed multitude. See, when the Israelites left Egypt, when they were finally told by Pharaoh, get out of my sight, it wasn't just the Israelites that left. Egyptians went with them. It was a mixed group that went with them, a rabble. Egyptians and others went with them. And so now those same people, and you can just look up a verse or two, after Moses had prayed for them, they're inciting the Israelites to complain. Okay, so, and I said, there's something for New Testament Christians here. You have a people who were in slavery. They were in bondage, right? They are brought out of that bondage by God. They are God's people. And then you have people who aren't God's people. Just because they left with the Israelites doesn't all of a sudden make an Egyptian an Israelite. That's not the way it works, right? You have people who are not God's people causing a stir among God's people. And then God's people jump in and they start complaining too. Is that not a lesson for Christians today in our interaction with the world? We have God's people, New Testament Christians, and yet many times we will allow the world to dictate how the church should run, how the church should be organized, what activities the church should be doing, and all of this type of stuff, and stirring up some trouble. Next thing you know, Christians jumping on the bandwagon and complaining about it all too. Hasn't changed, right? And a marker, or a couple of verses to mark down here. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, if you take notes, 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 16, there's the command to not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. I guess I should have said 2 Corinthians 6, 17 through 18, because 17 through 18 of 2 Corinthians 6 is to come out from among them and be separate. And then you have James chapter 4 and verse 4, and that is friendship with the world is enmity with God. That is opposition to God.
James, I'm sorry, James what?
4 and verse 4. And so the Israelites look back, they're regretting their choice and relishing the land of Egypt. And again, Luke 9:62. Can't set your hand to the plow looking back, right? Viewing their current situation with disgust. And each morning, or excluding the Sabbath, each morning the earth was covered in white with manna. The Psalm 78 and verse 25 says that manna, it's called the bread of the angels. That's Psalm 78:25. The Hebrew word manna, by the way, it literally means, what is it? That's what it means. The Hebrew word manna literally means, what is it? You know? As far as what it looked like, we've got a couple of things. Exodus chapter 16 and verse 14 says it was a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. In Exodus 16:31, it reads, it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So certainly not the same wafer you're getting in your communion cup this morning. And then between those two verses, in Exodus 16 and verse 21, we're told that it had to be collected before the sun grew hot because otherwise it would melt. Other than that, we don't know. So it's white, flaky, melts when it's too hot, and it's about the size of coriander seed. Covered the ground.
Snow.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like snow. Honey snow. There we go. There you go. Maybe go to one of those snow cone thing places, during the summer and get one with honey on it, and maybe you'll have an idea. I don't know. Probably not, though, because they did have to eat it and collect enough to finish eating for that day, and then, they had to collect enough before the Sabbath to carry them through the Sabbath also. And then real quick, and I'll end it here, even though Moses prayed for them, and the fire of the Lord, it says here in Numbers chapter 11 verses 2 and 3, that the fire died down, the outsiders stirred their emotions and they complained yet again. In verse 6, now our strength is dried up, there's nothing at all for this manna to look at. So with God on their side, having extended to them mercy and grace through trial and tribulation, leading them from bondage, the people showed nothing but unbelief, ingratitude, and self-pity. And the lesson for us today is when we have been brought out of bondage by the power of the cross, are we ungrateful? Are we showing unbelief? Are we just dwelling in self-pity? Or are we count your many blessings, as the song hymn goes, naming them one by one? Any closing thoughts or comments? Okie dokie. Well, hey, I appreciate everybody's kind attention. Remember, there's some bagels over there. All right.